The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 10th chapter. Jesus said, "Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Last September, the whole world was moved by a photo of a lifeless 3-year-old child in a red shirt and dark shorts, face down on a Turkish beach, his round cheek pressed into the sand as if he were sleeping, except for the waves that were lapping at his face. I was particularly moved because this little boy, whose name was Elan, is the age of my 2 grandsons, and even has a striking resemblance to one of them. The photo, by the way, is on display in the display case in the narthex, and I hope you take a look at it after the service. Elan was one of a countless number of Syrian refugees who died crossing the Mediterranean as they fled their war-torn country. His mother and older brother also died, and only his father survived. The words of the father as he filled out forms at the morgue to claim the bodies of his family were especially haunting. He said, "Now I don't want anything. Even if you give me all the countries of the world, I don't want them. What was precious is gone." The 4 million refugees who have fled Syria are among the most love-starved people in the world. They've been forced to flee their homes. In many cases, they have left family members behind, often in graves. They have nothing, and wherever they go, no one wants them. In Jordan, in Lebanon, in Turkey, even in most places in the West, Syrian refugees are unwanted. In the United States, a number of politicians have suggested that we should ban all Muslims from our country, or perhaps only accept Middle Eastern Christians as refugees. In fact, the U.S. House in December passed a bill that would immediately end the resettlement of all refugees from Syria and Iraq. And yet, isn't this just the opposite of what Jesus called on his followers to act? Love your enemies, he said. Do good to those who hate you. And Syrian refugees, of course, are not our enemies, nor do they hate us. But even if we thought they were our enemies, Jesus tells us to love them. I understand that terrorism is creating fear today. But we need to remember that these refugees are also victims of terrorism, and they deserve our compassion. The Bible, in fact, is full of refugee stories. Jacob and his family left Canaan for Egypt because of famine. Moses and the Israelites fled Egypt for the promised land because Pharaoh had forgotten Joseph and made slaves of the Hebrew people. Jesus was himself a refugee, fleeing Herod and finding refuge in Egypt. The lesson in all of this is that because the people of God have been refugees and migrants, strangers in strange lands, they should welcome the stranger. In our first reading today, we heard these words of Moses to the people of Israel. "You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." The call to welcome the stranger was anchored in the Torah and was part of the Hebrew community's faithfulness to God. When a traveler came to town, they were to wait by the village well, and it was incumbent upon the townspeople to house and feed them for the night. Of course, these travelers were very rarely family. They were most often folks unknown to the community. They were aliens and foreigners People who had different foods, different clothes, different languages, different gods. Opening one's home in those days was risky as well. Today, in our security-conscious age, we describe such a thing as out-and-out foolish. But such hospitality was central to the Hebrew community, to the Hebrew identity. They were defined by a generous hospitality, for they knew that such hospitality was central to the character of their God. The same was true for early Christian communities. Paul reminded the Romans in our second reading today to also extend hospitality to strangers. And in the letter to the Hebrews, the readers were reminded to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without even knowing it. In today's gospel reading, the word welcome occurs no less than 6 times in just that very short passage. If we put this gospel lesson in context, Jesus is speaking to the 12 disciples, and he's about to send them out on mission. And as they go, he tells them that they'll need to travel light, they'll need to take risks, they need to trust in God for their safety, and they need to rely on the hospitality of others. Whoever welcomes you welcomes me, he says, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. You know, Jesus was always willing to welcome those who others would consider unwelcome, and he called on his followers to do the same. He said, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Jesus is calling for hospitality that has no boundary and no limits, where a welcome is extended not in expectation of social gain, but for its own reward. Hospitality where no one remains excluded and unwelcome. So I believe that it is incumbent upon all of us as Christians to embrace the plight of refugee families in what is being called the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. It's thought that at least half of Syria's 22 million people have been displaced or killed. Imagine that, if that were our country. And as you know it from the news, millions have sought refuge in other countries from Syria. Many of them have fled to Europe. At least a couple of million of them are still living in refugee camps in neighboring Jordan and Lebanon. And at least 1 million more have been forced to flee their homes but are still in Syria in the midst of that war. But we also know that millions more around the world call themselves refugees. It's estimated that there are 60 million people around the world who are in refugee situations. There are Somalian refugee camps in Kenya today that are larger than Iowa City, Coralville, and Cedar Rapids combined. An estimated 350 to 500,000 in one camp alone. We're living in an age of unprecedented migration of people, a global exodus. So now I think is the perfect time for Christians to stand together and fight injustice. Pope Francis has said, a change of attitude toward migrants and refugees is needed on the part of everyone, moving away from defensiveness and fear, indifference and marginalization, all typical of a throwaway culture, towards attitudes based on a culture of encounter, the only culture capable of building a better, more just and fraternal world. So I think it's our crisis too. Now, even though it's our call as Christians to be welcoming and compassionate, another response to the refugee crisis that we've been hearing lately is fear, and I understand that. It's especially understandable after it was revealed that one of the attackers in Paris entered France as a Syrian refugee. Until 9/11, as a nation, we were relatively isolated when it comes to foreign terrorist attacks. We just didn't have any. But now we've had San Bernardino. We don't ever want it to happen again. I can understand that fear. But even so, I have to say that that fear is not Christian. Because the Bible reminds us over and over again that we need to trust the Lord and not live in fear. I also think that a bit of history and data can go a long way to dampen those concerns. For example, did you know that in the United States we've resettled almost 800,000 refugees since 9/11, since 2001? And in those 14 years, only 3 people have been arrested for terrorist activity, 2 of which were trying to send money to terrorist organizations abroad, and a third made threats that were later determined not to be credible. We heard on the news, I know just the day before yesterday, I think it was, of 2 more who were trying to send money overseas. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, which is the refugee resettlement organizations of Lutherans in this country, those of you who were at the forum saw a couple of their videos. They've resettled thousands of refugees in the past 25 years, and not one of them has been a terrorist. And there really is good reason for this. The vetting process of refugees who qualify for resettlement is more extensive here in this country than anywhere else in the world, and we've had that vetting process in place since the last Bush administration. The FBI, the State Department, national intelligence agencies, and the Department of Homeland Security are all involved in a process that takes upwards of 18 to 24 months with significant clearance hurdles, and this is after the United Nations has vetted them as well. So politicians who are trying to tell you a different story these days are only trying to create fear for their own political advantage. We've had that process in place for years. Refugees are not the threat that some try to make them out to be. Most people believe refugees are going to be a burden to the countries that receive them. But that's a total myth. In fact, the opposite is true. It turns out that refugees are a good investment. Studies show that welcoming refugees almost always has a positive effect on the host community and on the country's economy and wages. Now, I know that the solution to the refugee crisis is complex. But as Christians, we must do our part to help those who are fleeing the turmoil in their own lands by opening our hands and our hearts to them. And we do that by warmly welcoming them into our country, by empowering them to find the tools and the solutions that they need to build and maintain a prosperous new life in America. And if you're wondering what you can do, here are a couple of suggestions. As individual members of this congregation, you can write letters to your congressmen and women expressing your support for continuing to resettle refugees from Iraq and Syria and other places. Those of us who attended the forum between services had the opportunity to do that. And there are extra letters if you want to sign your name to them on those stands in the narthex just as you go out the door. I've been a pastor of 3 congregations that sponsored families in the past. And I will assure you that the language of refugee quickly fades away and is replaced by brothers and sisters and eventually by American. And so as a congregation, I would also challenge you to be open to assisting in the resettlement of 1 or more Syrian refugee families in Iowa City here in the future. We're at our best as Americans and as Christians, not when we turn our backs or demand our rights or talk about walls, but when we welcome the refugee, the immigrant, and the stranger. We're at our best as a people, as a community, as a nation, and as the church, not when we fear, but when we trust God and when we love and serve our fellow human beings.